The topic today that I wanted to talk about is language universals, and I had said Chomsky's universal grammar just because I wanted people to know that when I'm talking about universal grammar, I'm talking specifically about the theory that Chomsky came up with about a universal grammar that underlies all human languages. So let's just go through some of these examples, and we'll see how we might be able to think about language universals. So this is a version from a previous talk that I gave, so I'll try to remember some of the other things that I put in to update the article, update the talk a little bit, but we'll go through it, and if you have any questions, please ask. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what a language universal is. There are three kinds of language universals, which we'll talk about afterwards in the next slide. But basically what universals are patterns that we see across languages that keep on emerging, okay? We don't have the complete set of languages available to us, first of all because we don't know every single language in the world. We definitely don't know languages that have already come and gone and nobody ever recorded them, and we don't know all of the languages that will be born in the future. But as far as we know, we can see some very robust patterns in languages. There are three kinds of linguistic universals. There's absolute universals, which basically occurs no matter what language you're speaking, it's always exactly the same. So all languages have nouns and verbs. That's a pretty robust absolute universal. There are also implicational universals, which are expressed in terms of if your language has one thing, your language will also have another thing. So one example of that would be if a language has the words for myself and yourself, then it will also have a separate word for third-person reflexives, like himself or herself. Reflexives are used to distinguish between when you're referring to the same person again or referring to a different person. So instead of saying Bob hit him, you would say Bob hit himself, right? And that means different things. So if you have first or second person reflexives, you will have third person reflexives in your language. Another example of a universal is just a kind of, we call it a universal, but it's more of just an observation about how frequently certain grammatical things come up across the world's languages. And we would say, for instance, that it's a universal across languages that subject, verb, object, sentence order is much more common than verb, subject, object order, okay? So, and all of these could be explained, right, in many different ways. I will be trying to look at ways that linguistics explains them, okay? So first of all, we'll talk about the different ways. So there are discourse ways that you can explain some of the universals. So sometimes things are just useful to have when you're having a conversation, right? So they come up. There are processing explanations that you could give. Maybe your brain just can't handle certain kinds of structures, right? There is also what Chomsky would say is that there is an innate language ability that has specific characteristics, right, which constrains the kinds of languages that can exist. And that's an innate argument for universals. And then there are all kinds of others which I won't be addressing in this talk. So there's semantics, perceptual, sometimes maybe most of the world's languages used to have, ejectives, but most of them all died somehow, in some historical accident. And so we actually don't have a clear understanding of that, but I won't be talking about that. Generally speaking, we can talk about internal explanations, such as innateness, versus external explanations. And I'm talking about external to linguistics. So within linguistics, can you explain this universal, as opposed to, do you have to go outside of linguistics to like psychology, right, or some kind of social explanation, a kind of language universal. So for instance, a discourse pragmatics explanation of reflexives might be as follows. Right? If you remember, the universal about reflexives is that if you have a word for myself or yourself, you will also have a word for himself. And the reason is because, well, that's another way to say it. The reason is because Discourse pronouns, right, in distinction from plain pronouns in the third person are more useful than in the first or the second, right? So if you have any reflexive pronouns, they'll be third person reflexive pronouns. And why would that be the case? It's because when you're talking to somebody, there's only one of you, right? Right? And there's usually only one other person. So you don't usually need to distinguish between me and myself or you and yourself. However, when you're talking to somebody else, there's theoretically kind of an infinite number of third-person people that you could be talking about. So it's more important or more useful to have a word that distinguishes between whether you're talking about this person and him or this person and himself in a discourse setting. Does that make sense? So that would be kind of a conversational way to explain this universal. Okay. The problem with this is it can't explain everything, right? Because you could imagine all kinds of things that would make conversation more useful, but they don't always show up in the grammar like this. So why are these not grammaticalized? In addition, there are some things that are grammaticalized in other languages. For instance, there are discourse things in many languages of the Americas, native languages of North America, where in order to say any kind of a sentence, you have to have a grammatical particle that expresses whether you are saying that because you observed it first person, or you are saying that because you heard it from somebody else, or you're saying that just because you are kind of speculating. So you have these kinds of particles that express where you got your information from, and that's grammaticalized in that language. But I would want to know, in that case, why it's grammaticalized only in a very small set of languages, right? Whereas this kind of thing has a much broader appearance. There are also processing difficulties that might explain constraints on the kinds of languages that you have. And for instance, there's certain kinds of languages, sentences, which use center embedding that are difficult to process. So in English, you would have a sentence like, "Who did that Mary hit Bill surprise?" Right? Now, if I said that slowly, you can kind of make sense of it, but basically, it's not grammatical. Like, what I'm trying to say is, right, that Mary hit Bill surprised someone. Who was that person, right? Who did that Mary hit Bill surprise? In English, you would have to use some other kind of construction. You would have to say something like that Mary hit Bill surprised who? Or maybe, who did it surprise that Mary hit Bill? I like the third one the best. And what has been noticed is that for psychological reasons, which was not my specialty, but for brain processing reasons, center embedding is just very difficult to process. So it makes sense that there would be restrictions across languages that would restrict these kinds of center embedded sentences. Okay. The question that arises for me is, it's kind of a sliding scale, right? There are things that are definitely very easy to process, and then there are things that are very difficult to process, and then there are all kinds of things in between. So it's unclear to me how exactly that kind of an explanation can apply across the board. Does that make sense? Okay. When does something become too difficult for your grammar? Okay, so I'm going to talk about innateness, and you may recognize this person. This is Noam Chomsky, who is basically considered the founder of modern linguistics in the 50s, the 1950s, of generative linguistics. And people will talk about it being founded in different times. I prefer to think of it starting from his review of Skinner's, or B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior in 1959. So you see it was in the 50s or in the early 60s. So the basic claims that are behind Chomsky's hypothesis of universal grammar, right, of innateness, are number one, okay, language has an abstract structure, okay, that isn't always expressed at the surface. Okay, so you can't always tell from just a simple analysis of the surface structure, the pronunciation, and the sentences of a language, what the actual deeper structure of a language is. Because of this, a language should be almost impossible for a child to learn. Does that make sense? Because the only thing that the child hears is the actual sentences that are produced. They cannot hear this sort of abstract structure that's behind the sentences, right? And this is called the poverty of stimulus. So there's not enough information in the stimulus that a child receives when they're growing up to properly learn the grammar of a language that reflects the language that they then can demonstrate, the knowledge that they can of the language that they can then demonstrate as adults. But it is the fact that any child can learn any language, right, without any explicit training. There aren't classes for 3-year-olds, right, or 4-year-olds trying to teach them when you can say Bob told him to hit himself or whatever, and when you can say Bob told him to hit him. Nobody is teaching people these things as children, but everyone comes up with the same answers. So the hypothesis is that some parts of a language must be innate to humans, and that's what we call a universal grammar, right? And because of that, the correlate to that hypothesis is that all languages should therefore be constrained by this universal grammar. Do the basics make sense? The details I'm not going to get into because it's, first of all, it's not entirely clear because people are still developing the theory, but also because it's just, there's not enough time. So just briefly about internal versus external explanations. Basically, in linguistics, we like to look for internal explanations, partially because that's just our field, so we want to search for linguistic internal explanations before we appeal to psychological explanations. So you'll see linguists pushing the linguistic explanation of universals quite far, even to some kind of ridiculous lengths, you know, just because we want to exhaust all possibilities before we say, oh, well, maybe it's just a processing problem, right? So we have these really elaborate abstract structures. And generally, people who want to argue about, or who want to argue from the stance of innateness are also looking at language as a domain-specific part of your mind or your learning or your brain. So there's a special part of the brain or the special part of your mind that's specifically dedicated to the domain of language learning, language perception, and language production. The grammar, right? So Chomsky would say, it's as if there's an organ in your brain that's biological, its biological function is to learn and produce language. And it grows with you, right, as an infant. And then at a certain point, that organ can no longer develop, which is why you cannot learn a language past, say, the age of 13, 14, 15, right? Okay. But when we, I mean, you know, those of us who are not kind of strict or kind of rabid Chomskyans, right, we'll have to admit that there are other explanations. There are other explanations that are very plausible for many linguistic universals, okay? But as a linguist, I would say we should allow considerable room for a language-specific component. The reason is because grammars of languages, this is an important point, right? It seems that grammars of languages are more principled than they would need to be just to conform to, say, psychology or for communicative purposes. Another way to put that is, while it is universally asserted that language is present for communicative purposes, it's harder to demonstrate that grammar exists for the same reason, right? And you know this because many speakers who have trouble, for instance, learning a foreign language, can make all kinds of ungrammatical utterances and still make themselves perfectly understood, right? So it's not the case that you really need grammar to have communication, but you need grammar for a language, so what's going on there? A communicative explanation, to me, is inadequate to explain grammar as a whole. And that's what I said there, but in different words. Okay? So basically, first of all, I just want to stop here and recap some points that I wanted to make from before. Languages show a lot of diversity. We all know there's many, many different kinds of languages, and they have lots of different kinds of grammar. And I'm talking not just syntax, but phonology, right, as we talked about it in the last talk. And at the same time, there are many universal principles that constrain the kinds of languages that we see, right? So although we see a lot of diversity, things don't diverge in an infinite number of ways. You don't find, for instance, a language that makes questions by reversing all of the words of their sentence, right? That just doesn't happen. That's probably a processing constraint, by the way. Some of these, as I said, right, can be explained by non-linguistic principles, but many things cannot submit to such explanations, and they seem to be purely linguistic. Right. And then apart from that, as I gave you the argument from Chomsky about children learning language, apart from that, there's also separate reasons to believe that maybe at an underlying abstract level, there's one grammatical system that all children are born with that they just sort of modify in order to learn their specific language. It's kind of a crazy idea, right? But hopefully we'll be able to see some reasons, or see a couple of reasons why it might be the case, all right? So if we want to talk about language or linguistic universals in particular, if we believe in this universal grammar that Chomsky says, then Chomsky claims to be there, then the universal grammar would be the explanation for linguistic universals. I am going to skip this because this is going to be very complicated. So let's just talk about parameters. Okay, so what might the universal grammar look like? Okay, because the fact of the matter is, but once you say there's a universal grammar for all languages, the obvious problem is that, oh, but languages do not have the same grammars. What's going on there, right? One way to explain then how grammar can be universal is to say, okay, what universal grammar is really just a whole bunch of set parameters, maybe binary parameters, right? And then different languages just have different settings of those parameters. Does that make sense? It's as if there's the universal grammar is this giant switchboard, right, where everything is either on or off, right? Your language either has voiced obstruents, voiced fricatives, or it doesn't, right? So you check, and then all children know that only these parameters, this finite set of parameters exist, but what they're learning when they learn a language is what all the settings are, right? That might be one way to think of it, okay? Another way to think of it, which is not incompatible with the previous way, is maybe the universal grammar provides you with kind of a bare hierarchical syntax structure. If we're talking about syntax, right? Maybe things can only branch binary, right? You cannot have a hierarchical structure that's a tree with 3. You can only have 2 branching. This is given to you when you're born so that you'll only analyze languages in a certain way, right, with binary branching. Something like that. Okay? We in linguistics don't really talk about why there might be differences, okay, from one language to another. Like, what's the source of this grammatical difference as much? But we just are so occupied, there's just too much work to be done, just trying to explain how all of the different kinds of grammatical structures that we see might be arising from a single grammatical structure. And the work is kind of endless because, as you might imagine, the task is very difficult. But I will try to convince you at least part of the way there. Okay, so let's begin by looking at some correlations between different syntactical structures within one language. So in English, we would say, Hiro ate an apple. This is a good sentence in English, right? And in linguistics, we might make a hierarchical structure that looks like this. Okay, here's the subject, Hiro, and the order of the verb, and the object is this way, right? Hiro ate an apple. But in Japanese, we might say, Hiro ga ringo o tabeta, something like that. I don't speak Japanese, okay? But as you can see, this word, which means apple, the object, right, is in the opposite order, right, from English. So we call this verb-object order. So remember I was talking about the parameters, where it seems like it could be one way or the other? Okay. So it seems like there's a setting that might reverse this, okay? Now let's look at another structure. In English, you would say, if you have a prepositional phrase, you would say to Hanako, like I gave this book to Hanako. But in Japanese, an equivalent structure would be Hanako ni, where the to is kind of after, right? Again, the structure is reversed. Again, you see the preposition happens to the left in English and to the right in Japanese. So it's kind of reversed. This is a very English-centric presentation, as you see, right? Because I'm saying Japanese is the reverse of English. A Japanese presenter would say the opposite. Okay, but we have preposition, noun order, right? When you have a preposition that comes after a noun, we call it a postposition because it comes after, right? So we wouldn't say preposition or noun preposition. We would say noun postposition. So far we have two things that look like they're actually kind of the same. In English, you could say a picture of taka, right? A modifier comes after the noun. In Japanese, you would say taka no shashin, right? The modifier comes before the noun, okay? So again, we have these three, where they're reverse of each other. Now we have whole sentences. Masa thinks that Hiro ate an apple. So we have this complementizer, we call this a complementizer, excuse me. And there's a sentence here, right? Yeah, I have that here. Complementizer in the sentence. And this is what it would look like. Here's the complementizer, and this is the sentence, okay? In Japanese, we would say this, which I can't say. But the point to notice is that the complementizer comes after the sentence, okay? And it would look like that. The point, you see the complementizer is here after the sentence. So we have the opposite order. So we have all four of these which are just reverse of each other. Now it seems like something maybe deeper is going on here, right? So maybe, oh, okay, sorry, I forgot. So the word order patterns also show up in other languages. So English is not the only language that shows these correlations between all these orders. You might think that some languages would have, verb, object, and then noun, postposition. But in fact, these things tend to correlate together, and not just in language of Africa, Edo, for instance, or in Indonesian, which is not related. I chose languages that are not related to each other, right? So you can see that it's not because of historical accident that they all have the same structure. Edo, Indonesian, Thai, and Zapotec, which is in a native language of Mexico, and many others. The Japanese order is shown in Turkish. Is that true? Is that true? Some people know, right? Amharic, which is not related. Basque, which is not related to any language. Navajo, right? Okay. Yeah. So there's many, and Korean, right? Many languages that have this kind of order. So let's just do some. I'm just going to fly through some linguistics. Let's call V, P, N, right, and complementizer heads, right? Then we could say there are head initial languages, right, on this side, and head final languages, like on that side. So what we could say is that, look, there's an abstract structure postulating underlying all languages, right? You get that head complementizer, or whatever, right? Head complement structure. The only difference is whether they're reversed. So that's a parameter setting, head initial or head final. There are some problems with the head parameter. So I'm bringing up some problems to show you a more extreme version of a linguistic universal that somebody has proposed. So there's problems with the head parameter, right? The problem is that you would think that there could be languages which differ only in this relative ordering, right? And everything else would be the same, right? But there are even more correlations with a head parameter, okay, right? So, for instance, these are just examples, I'll go through them. You have V2 languages, but no V second to last languages. You have agreement with postpositions, but there are no languages that have agreement with prepositions. And many languages that have SOV order, that's head final order, right, also do not place question word sentence initially, as in English. In English, question words go at the beginning. Who did you see, right? What did you buy? I'll make these more clear, okay? The point is, there is a guy, Richard Kane, who has this really extreme theory who suggests that all of these together suggest that languages are actually all head initial, and there are no head final languages, okay? So he would reject that parameter setting. Actually, even Japanese is actually head initial. How do you do this? It's really crazy. Okay, so look, first of all, let's look at the data, okay? There are lots of languages where the verb always has to be in the second position of the sentence, but there are no languages where a verb can be always has to be in the second to last position. So many languages like German, here's the verb, okay? You could say, Hans backte gestern das Brot, right? Hans baked the bread yesterday. right? You could say, yesterday baked Hans the bread, right? You could say, the bread baked Hans yesterday. Do you see, you could say all of these are fine, but the verb always has to come second. Does that make sense? The way that we get this in Keynes' theory, right? How do we get the verb always in the second place? It's always movement. So this is a kind of a very linguistic thing. Words move in order to get to the right place. So first you move Hans up, okay? Then you move bake up, okay? If you were going to put gestern, obviously you would have to move gestern up, right? And then bake can still go in that position. And likewise with the object, das Brot. Das Brot backte Hans gestern. I know I went through that very fast, but does that at least make sense? Right? You need something like this in order to explain this phenomenon. Okay? I hope not losing people. But the main point is that there is no language, right, that does the same thing in the opposite direction, which you might expect if there was just a parameter setting that does head initial, head final, right? There's no language where this verb in a head final language can move up to that position, like second to last, okay? No such language exists. No, I mean, like, there's not even one, okay? So it's a pretty robust universal. So this is fine, this is not. Why, okay? Then there's also agreement in some languages between postpositions and nouns, okay? This is an Abkhaz language. You can see there's agreement with the noun and the preposition. You see how it agrees? A postposition. Oh, I got something funny happening. Anyway, this is showing you the agreement, which you can see here. But there is no language in which agreement happens with prepositions. And you can just take my word for it that you can explain this, again, by assuming that the postposition is actually a preposition and that the noun moves, okay? Et cetera, okay? Now we're going to talk about questions. This is the strangest one. So you see that in English, question words happen at the beginning. Who do you love? Where did you go? Right? But very few languages, almost no languages, put a question in the opposite end, which you might expect in a head initial, head final parameter kind of situation. In fact, what happens when a language is quote-unquote head final is that usually question words stay in place. They don't move around. That happens in Japanese. So, right, in English, you would put this who here. Who do you love? Right, but in Japanese, the who stays where it should go. Right, you, who, love. Do you see how this is the object? And that's the head? Yeah. Okay. So the way that we get questions in English is well documented, right? First, you have to put do here. Then you move the who up here, okay? Who do you love? Does that make sense? Because the who has to start off being the object of love. That's the whole point of the question. Who do you love? If you have Japanese, here you have the order that's head final, okay? You cannot move to that position. Why is that the case? So instead, Kane proposes that Japanese is not head final, it's head initial. So it looks like this. And here is the question particle. So in fact, point is everything moves, okay? The question word moves here, okay? This is going to be head final. So the whole sentence moves, okay? So in fact, that head final structure is sort of a relic of the rest of it. Instead of it being a head and then the complement here, actually it's the head and the complement here, but the whole complement moves. So he moves everything else, okay? But what's good about this is that once this sentence fills that position where normally the question word goes, you cannot move this question word anywhere else. There is no place for it to go. So this explains why in supposedly head final languages, this question word cannot move as it does in English. Or you might think it does, okay? So it explains all of these correlations, and I will have to say that this particular set of correlations does not seem to be the kind of thing that psychology or processing or anything could explain. So basically, okay, right, there are some universal patterns which constrain variation among languages. Linguists take the perspective that there's a set of universal grammatical principles which constrain these languages, okay? Innate universal principles. That's what linguistics is about, okay? And as I say, it can result in insightful and interesting analyses. Sometimes the analyses can be crazy, and so linguists will push back against other linguists. That's too much, right? But I will have to say that the Keynes theory is convincing in a lot of ways, okay? And these are my references. I hope that wasn't too fast or confusing, but at least it's an introduction to how universal grammar works, okay? Yeah, there are a lot of languages that have more free word order. Sometimes people will just say, I don't know how to explain that, it's free word order. I think usually people try to find which word order is the most common or the least marked. Does that make sense, right? And there are different ways to try to figure that out. Like which ones do kids come up with first, and that kind of thing. And then we'll say that the other movements the other orders are derived by movement for specific kinds of discourse reasons or meaning reasons. But you'd have to find those patterns. I don't know.